The following program will make you want to grow things and experience new and wonderful dreams about your plants, garden, and garden design. Listener participation is always strongly advised. Good evening and welcome to Down the Garden Path with your host Joanne Shaw and Matthew Dressing right here on Reality Radio 101. To get on board, send us an email right now. Our email address is instudio101@gmail.com. And now, ladies and gentlemen, right to your hosts of Down the Garden Path, Joanne Shaw and Matthew Dressing.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone to Down the Garden Path, where we discuss down-to-earth tips and advice for your plants, gardens, and landscapes. As landscape designers and gardeners, we think it is important and possible to have great gardens that are low maintenance, and we want to help you make it happen. I am Joanne Shaw, landscape designer and owner of Down-to-Earth Landscape Design. I've been designing beautiful landscapes for homeowners east of Toronto for over a decade. With me is my co-host, Matthew Dressing. Welcome, Matthew.
Welcome, Joanne. Good evening, everyone. I am Matthew Dressing, horticulturist and landscape designer and owner of Natural Affinity Designs. Natural Affinity is a landscape design and garden maintenance firm servicing Toronto and the Eastern GTA. Joanne and I enjoy hosting Down the Garden Path each week, bringing you interesting, relevant, and helpful topics to help you achieve a great garden. We learn right along with you from each other, from our research, and for the guests that join us here on the show. As always, we welcome your questions via social media and email.
Excellent. We want to thank you once again for joining us live here on Down the Garden Path, and to let you know that this show is also released as a podcast later, so you can always check out past shows of Down the Garden Path on your favorite podcast app. And while you're there, don't forget to subscribe so that you'll be notified when new content arrives. So please also like, share, and leave us a comment.
That's right. So if you guys have been tuning in as your regular listener, you know that it's a Down the Garden Path a month theme. And this month's theme, the theme of March, is growing. We're talking all about growing. So we all like to grow plants in many different places besides in the ground. So this month we're going to discuss, and we've been discussing, what it takes to get growing in different places, from starting seeds indoors to raised beds and containers. The possibilities are endless. And tonight, as we continue our discussion, we are joined by author and garden writer Tara Nolan as we talk about growing in raised beds. So if you want to join the conversation, perhaps you have a question for Tara, you want to share an experience about your raised beds, we'd love to hear from you. Write us in the studio here at instudio101@gmail.com.
Excellent. Thanks, Matthew. And I'll tell our listeners a little bit about Tara. Tara is a garden writer, author, editor, and speaker. She is co-founder of the award-winning garden website Savvy Gardening, savvygardening.com. Her work has appeared in the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, CBC Life, and Garden Making. Her first book, Raised Bed Revolution, Build It, Fill It, Plant It, Garden Anywhere, was published by Cool Springs Press in 2016. Tara contributed to a chapter to Gardening Complete, released in 2018, and she was the award-winning web editor of Canadian Gardening Magazine's website for 6 years, and appeared as gardening expert on WNED Buffalo's gardening special, Garden Wisdom, in 2016. Her second book, Gardening Your Front Yard, Tips and Ideas for Big and Small Spaces, will be published in March of 2020. Welcome to the show, Tara.
Thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome.
So, raised beds. So, I think a lot of people love container gardening and growing in raised beds. I myself have a balcony, so everything I do is above ground. I did get to check out your Raised Bed Revolution, and it's absolutely a beautiful book. But I was wondering, what inspired your book? What got you inspired into specifically being into raised beds?
Well, the first thing that my husband and I did when we moved to our current home just over 8 years ago, I'm in Dundas, which is just a part of Hamilton now, was we started looking for ideas for raised beds because we had that typical in-ground veggie garden sort of at the corner of our yard, and we just wanted to make it more aesthetically pleasing. So we thought we'd build some raised beds just to organize it a little bit, and that kind of threw us into this whole journey of raised beds because now I have quite a few. And so when the book opportunity came up, I really wanted to show a broad range of project ideas because some people do have a yard like mine where they can have a bigger raised bed, while others might have a corner of a patio or a balcony and a smaller space. So I tried to create just a book that had ideas with both sides to it. So whether you had a big or a small space, you could still have a raised bed.
Very nice. Very nice.
That is excellent, yes. And it seems to be so popular right now, too.
Absolutely. I think, people both young and old are coming on to the idea of raised beds and all of their benefits. So, for people that are getting older and have problems bending down or kneeling, the raised bed can be accommodated to whatever height you need it to be. And then, of course, it's a great option for families who want to start growing their own food.
Very cool. And what do you guys grow in your raised beds at home mainly?
Oh gosh, all sorts of things. I have garlic that will hopefully be poking up soon. I haven't been able to get out to check, but because I've been on the couch with a broken leg. But I have garlic that will be coming up in the spring, and then I'll have the garlic scapes probably come June, which is great. And of course, they harvest in July. And then I'm going to be getting some cold tolerant veggie seeds in fairly soon. So things like beets, carrots, kale, lettuces, peas. I'll be sowing those. And then I always grow tomatoes every year, peppers. I've got some really neat small patio varieties that I'm trying this year that are perfect for pots. So I think I have some watermelons and small squash. So really great ideas for all of the different size raised beds that I have. I try to kind of figure out what's going where, and then I always end up with more than I can plant. So,
So how many do you have, Tara? How many different beds do you have?
I have about 8 raised beds, and then I have some fabric raised beds as well. I have 3 of those.
Okay.
And last year for my new book, I had a couple of smaller ones built. So I have a really nice live edge raised bed in my front perennial garden. So I snuck in some tomatoes and peppers and a basil plant in there. And then I built one out of a window well for my side yard. So that had peppers last year. So yeah, I have lots of options, and I kind of move things around and do a little bit of crop rotation every year.
Very cool. Very, very cool. So if you go through the book, if you have a chance to go through her book, your book, there's lots of different and really cool ideas about raised beds and how to build them. Well, how did you kind of come up with some of the designs and recommendations that you give to your readers?
Well, I think social media is a great source of ideas. So I had found some projects from, I think one of them was from Bonnie Plants. And so they had done this really great raised bed with benches, which ended up on the cover. So they gave me permission to recreate that. And then I had some ideas myself, and then I also hired a builder because I'm fairly proficient in woodworking, but I needed someone to help me build things really quickly. So I had this great builder, Scott McKinnon, who I had met through mountain biking, actually. He came and he designed some of them, and I gave him some ideas for a couple that I had wanted to build, like a Versailles-inspired planter. And I had one where I wanted to use corrugated steel on the sides, so he was able to help figure those out, and we built some together as well. So, yeah, I tried to include kind of a a range of ideas for people that did have woodworking skills, but then I have a not handy, no problem chapter where I talk about upcycling or kits and easy ways to have raised beds.
Excellent. Well, that's great. So it's really a raised bed for anybody and any level of gardening as well as any budget.
Absolutely.
That's really important because that's great because not all of us have this huge amount of space. So I think that's great that something appeals to everybody. Before you, what should people consider, especially now we can plan, it's still a little too early to get out there, right? So what should you consider, what should our listeners consider before deciding to build or grow in raised beds? What should be involved? What do you recommend as far as the planning stage?
Well, you definitely want to make sure that the space gets at least 6 to 8 hours of sunlight in a day because all of those heat levers like tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers are going to need that sunshine to thrive. So even if it's a corner of your driveway or a patio, you want to make sure that you get that hot summer sun. And definitely, if you have hard-packed or clay soil, raised beds are a great option because you can just put them over top and, if you put them at a certain height, then those veggies aren't going to be reaching down into that hard subsoil and hitting a brick wall. So they're a really great option for people that have soil concerns, or even if you have to put them on, paving stones or asphalt, you can control all of the soil that goes into your raised bed.
Excellent. Is there a height recommendation that you have?
I usually say about 10 to 12 inches high, and then a standard raised bed would be about 3 to 4 feet wide by 6 to 8 feet long. And the reason for that as well is that it's a kind of a comfortable size for you to be able to reach into it so you're not walking through and disturbing that soil because it can become hard packed over time, even in the raised bed. So it'll remain nice and loose and friable if you constantly amend it for one thing, and then also are just reaching in to weed and plant and do all the things that you need to do.
That's a great point, Tara, because I know I have more and more of my landscape design clients are looking for raised beds and wanting to grow vegetables, but they're also keen and they're literally like, I want it to be like 8 feet by 8 feet or 8 feet by 10 feet. Mm-hmm. And, and I'm having to kind of pull them back and say, well, you really don't. Yes, you might have the space, but you need to kind of create, smaller groups, smaller areas. Don't you agree?
Absolutely. And actually a tip for that is if you are putting together a few raised beds, to make the paths wide enough for a wheelbarrow to go down. Because if, the farther raised beds, you're trying to amend the soil and bringing in compost or soil, it's really hard to get to them if you don't have a wider pathway. So I always recommend that because people do get really excited, but if the raised beds are too close together, then it's really hard to access each one.
Right. And I also think people don't realize how much food, you don't need, you can grow a lot of food in a small space, too.
Absolutely. You can pack a lot into one, 4 by 6 raised bed. And the thing is, I do recommend if people are starting for the first time to start small because it can be very overwhelming throughout the summer months if you have this massive urban farm that you've created, unless you're ready for, for the work and the watering that comes with it.
Yeah.
So, Tara and Joanne, we have a question. Ray writes in, hello, Joanne and Matthew. Thank you so much for being on the air this evening, as we really need this. My question for your guest, what is the basic advantage to having a raised bed versus conventional beds? Are they used for both flowers and vegetables? Stay healthy, Ray.
Perfect. Well, the raised beds, I have found a study actually that has been cited in various places where they found that you can get more food per square foot, probably almost double or more yield per square foot in a raised bed than you can in an in-ground garden. And I think one of the reasons is that you aren't walking between those typical rows. You can plant things more closely together. In a you want to make sure that you mind the seed packet or the spacing directions on a tag, but you can plant more intensively in a raised bed garden, and the soil remains nice and loose and friable because it's not becoming hard packed by walking along and throughout over time. And I think, there are other benefits. The soil does warm up sooner in the springtime in a raised bed, which is great. There's the accessibility options, and I mix food and flowers. So I like to plant zinnias and cosmos in my raised beds, not only to attract the pollinators, which are then in turn going to pollinate your squash blossoms and your tomato blooms, but also just for summer vases. It's great to have flowers to be able to cut and display in your home or on your deck. And so I like to plant a nice mix of both.
Nice. Very nice.
Excellent. That was a great question, Ray.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ray, for your question. I was just thinking Ray and raised beds. Anyway. You mentioned soil, though. So soil is always very important. One of the questions that I've heard before, too, is when planting in raised beds or big containers like I do, what soil is the best to be planting or using in your raised bed or your containers, or what would you think?
So in a raised bed, I used triple mix. I called a local garden center and I ordered what I thought was the best quality triple mix that they had, and then I top dressed it with compost. Now, there's lots of different, it depends on where you live, so there's going to be lots of different soil formulations. I would just call your local supplier and say that you're growing, an organic vegetable bed and you'd like a good quality soil to put in it. And then I always recommend just amending it with a little bit of compost just to add some nutrients into the soil. Now, if you're growing in smaller containers, you want a potting soil because you want it to be lighter weight, and the garden soil is going to be too heavy if you're on a balcony, for example. So you can get the bags of soil to put into your containers as opposed to getting a delivery of garden soil for your raised beds.
Would you still add compost to the potting soil, or?
I do. I always add a little bit over top, maybe about an inch or so. And if you're growing food as well, and you're pulling out your peas in the middle of the summer, I always recommend adding a little bit back in at that point as well, because it just adds some nutrients back into the soil. The pea roots are going to take some of the soil with it, but they'll also have leached some of the nutrients out. So I like to have a little bit of compost on hand just to toss in the garden throughout the summer.
Yeah, good idea. Definitely. I kind of do what you do, where I'll use some potting mix or a large amount of compost. I just have one big dark black nursery pot that just stays in there. So I use a little bit more heavier stuff, but it works great. Adding a little bit of compost to your soils to amend them and give them that boost just works beautifully.
Absolutely.
I love go ahead, Matt.
No, go for it.
I love the fact that you mentioned that having the bed raised kind of extends the season a little bit, right? Because the soil will warm up a little faster. Do you find is there any beneficial at the end of the season as well?
Absolutely. I live in a bit of a microclimate because I'm just almost under the Niagara Escarpment, so I feel like things last a little bit longer in my garden. But there are season extenders you can add. I added like a little brackets from the plumbing department, and then PEX pipe to make a bit of a mini hoop house to one of my raised beds. So I add floating row cover over my crops in the late fall when I hear there's going to be a hard frost, just to try to allow them to live a little bit longer and produce more. And so that usually extends even into November, what I can pick from the garden.
Wow, that's a really great idea. Yeah, I might have to try something like that for my container.
Yeah, definitely. You get more food. It's a great idea to kind of just extend that season a little bit longer and eke out as much as you can.
You could you even turn into some of your summer crops? Kind of, you've harvested them. They're falling by the wayside. Could you replace them in your beds and put in some cooler season lettuces and other crops for the fall?
Absolutely. Yes, I do. I do usually plant around August, late August, sometimes even early September. I'll try to get some lettuces or greens like spinach and kale, and then even root veggies that will have the time to develop before the first frost, and then they can last into the fall.
Very nice. Very
Excellent.
nice.
When it comes to the spring, Tara, do you think like Matt and our show last week was talking a lot about prepping, letting people know some ideas to prep their gardens outside. But we were mostly talking about in the ground gardens, right, Matthew? Are there is there anything you think you need to do differently in a raised bed?
I'm not sure about it differently. I definitely amend the soil in the spring, so that's something that could happen right now. I was going to check out under my leaf pile and see if I had any leaf mold that I could maybe work into the soil in a couple of weeks. And I'm always out there with my trowel, just seeing if the soil's workable yet or not, because once it is, then you can actually just start sowing seeds right into it.
Okay, so good. So you, timing-wise, because we weren't, our listeners do come from all over, so we were it's always hard to tell them when they can start. But you feel like, once the garden is workable, the soil's workable, you can start doing some direct sowing?
Direct sowing of cool weather crops, for sure. And I'm in just outside Hamilton, so I'm in a bit of a warmer climate. So I know even when I had family that used to live in Port Perry, then they were about 2 weeks behind. So it just depends on on where you live and where you live in Canada as far as being able to start your crops. But yeah, just keep an eye on the soil. Keep an eye on. I mean, it snowed last night, so I think things are still a little bit cold. But yes, definitely keep an eye on the soil.
So everybody, if you're just tuning in, thank you for tuning in. You are listening to Down the Garden Path here on Reality Radio 101. And again, if you're just tuning in, we are talking with Tara Nolan. Tara is a garden writer, author, editor, and speaker, one of the co-founders of SavvyGardening.com. And we're talking about raised beds, continuing our theme of March of growing. We're talking about growing in our raised beds. And the adventures there. So if you do have a question, which we have a couple we'll get to in just a moment, you can write us here at instudio101@gmail.com and send some questions to Tara. And speaking of which, Tate writes in, hi, do raised beds help save water, or do we need to water more? Thank you for your answer.
So raised beds do require, in a really hot summer, drought, if we're in a drought condition, you're going to want to water them every day. But if you do practice a bit more of intense planting, which will also keep the weeds down, the soil does retain water a little bit longer. So, you can just keep an eye on it and, stick your finger in the morning and just just see how the soil feels. And then if it feels like it's super dry, then you'll need to water.
Very cool. Yeah, I found the same thing in my big planter on the balcony with the soil exposed. If I have just one big tomato plant or something, it dries out super quickly. And I am watering it like once a day. So yeah, putting down some mulch and stuff for sure. What about something like an Ula or like those big plant nannies or something like that?
Yeah, definitely. If you want, to add some irrigation into the garden, I think that's a great idea that you could put that in. And certainly, whenever I get a really heavy rain, I know I don't have to water for a couple of days. So that's always a great indicator as well. If you have a really heavy rainstorm, don't worry about watering the next day. The garden's likely going to be fine.
Nice. So we have a second question. Scott writes in, hello, everyone. I know your guest had a book published in 2016, but is it still in publication? If it is, where can I purchase it? Thank you. So where can our guests find your book?
Thank you. Well, the book is available. I guess you can order online right now. That's probably your best bet because of our current situation. So Indigo, Amazon, any of the places that you would regularly order books from.
Excellent. And the name, why don't you tell us the name of the book again? Sorry, I'm looking for it on my notes, but go ahead, Tara. I'm sure you know the name.
Yeah, it's Raised Bed Revolution.
Excellent. The Raised Bed Revolution.
Yes.
Very cool. Very cool. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. Keep them coming. You can write Tara instudio101@gmail.com. Speaking of books, you have a new book. I think you just published like 13 days ago, didn't you?
Yes, it came out on the 10th, Gardening Your Front Yard.
Very nice. So what do you tell us a little bit about your new book? What does it cover?
Absolutely. So this one is sort of a broad idea book because, again, I try to consider ideas for both big and small spaces. And like Raised Bed Revolution, it has some project plans as well as planting suggestions. I went and had a photographer shoot a few gardens for ideas, and there's inspiration for different types of gardens, like rain gardens, for example, and those river rock beds that you might see in a few gardens that are great at filtering water in really heavy rainfalls and diverting some of it from the sewer system. And then I have some projects to attract pollinators, so I created this really great pollinator palace. I got some inspiration from the Chelsea Flower Show back in 2017 when I went, and this gentleman, John Cullen, he had created this really neat pollinator palace out of gabions. So, you know, those structures that are used, you probably use them in landscaping for holding in stone, and he used them with all sorts of debris from the yard, like sticks and pine cones, as shelter for insects. And so I did that with some old milk crates that I found that are kind of rusty, and they're metal, and they just look really neat in the front garden among my pollinator plants. So I did that, and I planted a sedum carpet on a really small front lawn, and I built a little lettuce side table for your front yard patio, because I talk about the social aspects of front yard gardening. So, you know, lots and lots of ideas, whether you want to just overhaul a small part of your garden or if you want to really make over the entire thing.
Oh, that sounds great. Because, yeah, there's some people who, you know, their best sun might be in their front yard, right?
Exactly. That might be your optimal growing conditions. A lot of people, especially in urban areas, might have a neighbor's tree or a tree in their own backyard that shadows everything, and they have problems with roots and things like that. So sometimes, you know, you might need to grow your veggies in the front yard or on your driveway. And so I have a food section that covers that, and then I have flowers and environmentally friendly options, eco-friendly or grass alternatives. So lots of different ideas packed into it.
And just for our listeners, once again, the title of your book, the new book that was available is?
It's Gardening Your Front Yard, Projects and Ideas for Big and Small Spaces.
Perfect. I like your titles, Tara. They're very to the point.
Yes, very succinct.
Oh, very succinct, very succinct. I just had another question about the raised beds, and I'm sure this can apply whether they're in the front yard or in the backyard. I think most people, the material of your choice is going to be wood. Would you agree?
Absolutely, yes.
Now, what do you recommend? Because then becomes, well, what wood do I use that's quote-unquote safe to use for vegetables?
So I use untreated cedar for all my projects. And I know my one partner for Savvy Gardening, Nikki Jabbour, she's on the East Coast, and she uses hemlock, so that's more readily available to her. So, you know, whatever you are able to get at your local garden center, your local lumber yard, you can have a chat with someone there about the best rot-resistant woods, because some are softer, so you don't want to use something that is going to decompose, you know, in the next couple of years. Cedar is supposed to stand the test of time, and my raised beds that are built from cedar, my first ones, when we first moved here, they're just about 8 years old now, and they are still perfectly intact, and the wood is structurally good. The only thing that's happened is over time with the freeze and thaw, they've shifted a little bit on themselves. So that's one recommendation I have for a big raised bed, is to maybe have a midpoint stake along the long end, and it just holds everything a little bit more snug and uniform and in place.
Okay, perfect. Well, that is great to know. What is another, like, next to wood, what would you think the next most popular type of raised bed?
I mean, I've seen people just use, you know, paving stones or bricks to create their raised beds. I have a few fabric raised beds, which I mentioned, and those are great for growing things, because what happens is the air is able to move through them. They're permeable, and so it causes this process called root pruning, which creates a stronger root system in your plant. So I've had success growing melons and tomatoes and peppers in fabric raised beds, and they're also great because if you have something that is a vigorous spreader like mint, you don't plant that right in your garden. You want to have a separate container to keep it you know, from spreading everywhere. So fabric raised beds are really great options for mint and chamomile as well.
Well, can you tell us a little bit more about fabric raised beds?
So I have a huge, I think it's 20 gallons, and so that one took a lot of soil. I ended up putting just some black earth on the bottom, and then I put the good soil, about halfway up. And so, I discovered those a few years back. I think in Quebec City was the first time I saw them, and the ones I have are called Smart Pots, and they were distributed by a company called Les Urbains Cultures, pardon my French accent, and they were using them all over the city. They were at the Parliament buildings with a mix of food and flowers. I saw them on a rooftop garden because they're really light. So one of the benefits of growing in a fabric planter is they're a little bit lighter weight, obviously, than wood. And if you have a smaller one and you do want to empty it out in the fall, you can just empty the soil into your garden and shake it out and fold it up and put it away until spring. So that's another benefit as well.
Excellent. So they are, so I just Googled it. So Smart Pots, so smartpots.com. So that's great to know. So they are actually containers, but they're made out of fabric.
Yes, they're like at the I think they call them post-consumer recycled materials. And so they're, sewn into these little pots, usually with handles, which is nice because you can then move them around the garden. I think I have one that doesn't have handles, but they are more widely available than when I first saw them several years ago now. So I've seen them, at a few garden centers, and I think there's a few different companies now that offer them.
Excellent. And I think I have something made of the same material that actually we have screwed onto the fence. It's more of like more of a bag, but that it goes against the fence. So I actually grow my lettuce in that in my backyard.
That might be a smart pot as well because you have the hanging pouches. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
So how long do these fabric raised beds last? Can you keep them over winter with all the soil, or is it something that like our listeners would want to empty and clean and dry out between the two seasons?
So I have one really big one, and then I have one kind of medium-sized fabric raised bed that is around the side of my house, and both of them I left with the soil in because it took quite a bit to fill them. So I guess it's kind of a test to see how they last over the winter. But the one I've had for a couple of years, and it's still going strong and fine. And I kind of just shifted it to a different part of the patio last year in case it was really wet after the winter underneath.
Okay. Yeah. So there's nothing that's gonna they're not breaking down in one season kind of thing. I can just kind of picture how quickly the coir, those cocoa liners just kind of disintegrate.
Yes. No, they're definitely a lot stronger than that.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
So Roy has written in again. He says, "Hello, fellow gardeners. A new listener here from Raleigh, North Carolina. Such a relief to hear some positive information today. Does your guest ever do seminars or talks in the U.S.? I would love to hear as I go to as many seminars about gardening as I can every year. Thank you."
Well, I haven't made it into the U.S. yet to do any talks, but I do give a lot in Ontario here where I live. So, for the most part, any of my talks in the U.S. have been via a podcast or a radio show. But I'm not ruling it out.
Yeah, exactly. So, Ray, if you have any connections for Tara, you'd happily go, right? Except for this time of year, once our little pandemic is over.
Once things are rolling again, yes.
That's right.
But if Ray and maybe our other listeners wanted to, hear more from you, Tara, where can they find you online?
Well, I run the gardening website with two partners called savvygardening.com. So we're very active on social media, on Facebook, on Instagram, Twitter, Pinterest. So you can find more information there. I do also have a Raised Bed Revolution Facebook page where I try to post ideas and tips and inspiration. And I'm on Instagram as Tara_E, and I share my gardening adventures and other crafty things on there as well.
Very nice. And so the handles for Savvy Gardening, is it just at Savvy Gardening?
It's at Savvy Gardening for everything, yes.
Perfect. Super easy.
Perfect. And Nikki, and I know Nikki has joined us on the show as well in the past, and we're hoping to have Jessica on soon. So all three of you have, are definitely popular with our listeners. And I know they've actually reached out and asked us to have Savvy Gardeners on. So that's why you're here.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you.
I really loved your idea. I love it in your new book how you had, was it apple crates that you made the little Gambium cages, the little insect overwintering area?
Oh, so yes, those are they're old rusty milk crates that I found, and I was looking to source a gabion, but it seemed to be a bit hard not going through a wholesaler. So when I was at a local antique market, I saw these milk crates, and they were stacked, and I thought, well, that looks exactly like a rusty old gabion, really. So they were perfect. And then I ordered mason bee nesting tubes to put in them as well, and it was really cool because at the end of the summer, as I was out there gardening one day, I kept checking on them, and I noticed that some of them were filled. So that was really cool because it showed that it was being put to use.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think we focus on bringing them in the garden, but I think we forget that they all have more of just that first attraction part of their life cycle, that we forget to create homes or leave little spaces for them to overwinter or take shelter and be there for the rest of their life cycle and leave their next generation behind.
Exactly. And so it's nice to have things like that in the garden that will keep them there and shelter them and keep them coming back.
Yeah, exactly.
And on that note, I think it's a good time for all of us to remind everybody that is, now that we're all, kind of going through a bit of a crisis and spending more time at home, getting excited about gardening, that it's not a good idea for the insects to start cleaning up our gardens too soon. I know everybody kind of wants to get out there, and Matthew and I have talked about in the past about compressing the soil, whether it's in your lawn or your level vegetable gardens, but also considering the insects, right, and all of our pollinators that are still overwintering in our garden and just waking up.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's a good tip.
Yeah, because like Matthew said, we're all so keen about planting stuff to attract them, but then we kind of tidy up the garden either too much in the fall or too early in the spring, and then we kind of defeat our purpose, right? So all the planting we're doing, is meant to have them hang around a little bit so that they're here for the following year.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we have another listener question. Brian writes in, can your guest talk about front yard gardening, in quotes? I know that raised beds can be used in your front or backyards, but front yard gardening seems to be an issue for controversy with either neighbors or municipalities. Can Tara embellish a bit about these issues? Thank you.
Absolutely. I definitely, kind of included a little note at the beginning of the book about, consulting your bylaws. So, there are still areas and even homeowner associations, which is more a thing in the States, that prohibit certain types of gardening. So you do want to make sure that nothing is going to, sort of dampen your plans before you get underway. And so it's definitely a good idea to check. And, certainly, I think depending on what you want to do in your front yard garden, some people just throw caution to the wind and rip everything up and start fresh and have a garden, and it's absolutely fine. But, it might be something worth discussing with your neighbors if you do want to, rip everything up. I do recommend, starting with small areas. You don't want to take out all of your garden and grass, or all of your grass rather, and not have a plan to put back in place. And definitely, if you're digging in your garden, I also recommend checking with your call before you dig programs in your area.
Yeah.
So you want to make sure that, even if you're planting a giant tree and need to dig a really big hole, you want to make sure you know where all of those underground gas lines or any other cables are located. And so the utility companies can come out and mark those for you.
Excellent. And that's another advantage to growing in containers, or raised beds, right, is that you're not really digging down and risking, digging into those utilities.
Exactly. And I think, too, if you're concerned, I put a smaller raised bed. I tucked it into the corner of my perennial garden. Or if you have an established perennial garden, you could, put a tomato with a nice obelisk around it in between, your bushes and your perennial plants that come up in the spring. So, there's lots of ways to integrate food and flowers together without just having all raised beds, which is also an option, too. And I have seen it on some of my walks. There's a couple in my town where They have put up just nice, tidy rows of raised beds, and that looks really great too. I think mindsets are shifting. I think, I talk a little bit about that idea of the perfect lawn with absolutely no weeds. I think that idea is becoming a bit antiquated as people realize that spraying is harmful to the beneficial pollinators that do come through your property. So, I think we'll see a lot more gardens or a lot more front gardens transforming maybe from all of that grass to having a bit more garden space, if not all garden space.
Excellent. Do you have any favorite things? Because I love the idea. Most of my garden is actually in my front yard. So I'm wanting to, and these onions that I started by seed, so I've actually started some onions by seed, and they are probably destined for my front yard. So are there any other vegetables that you find, work really well with ornamental plants, more shrubs and perennials?
Absolutely. I think a lot of herbs look really great because of their foliage and their texture even, and their scent, of course. When you walk by, you can smell them in the garden, which is really nice. So there's lots of really lovely types of sage. I had, I think, a pineapple sage in one of my pots last year, and even with basil, I had a lovely variegated variety. So there's lots of pretty herbs that you can put in the garden. Lemon thyme is another really nice edging plant. And then Swiss chard, you can get peppermint Swiss chard, rainbow Swiss chard. A lot of those greens look really ornamental as well because displayed against the flowers that you put in your garden, they're just a really nice backdrop of foliage.
Excellent. That's a great idea. Yeah. And I think, amending, when you're amending the soil for your garden, you're feeding your vegetables and herbs as well.
Exactly, yes.
And I think about, too, all the different ground covers that people ask me about, what kind of ground cover to put in their gardens. And, it just even occurred to me, like, a lot of herbs might make great ground covers.
I think so. I use a lot of different herbs just along my garden edging. And then, thyme is a great one because it does spread over time. And, it can create a really lovely, area, fill a really lovely area of the garden.
Those are great tips.
Mm-hmm. There are.
Lots of.
Are there anything else that, I know time's always flying really fast. Any other tips that you have for people that are just starting out and starting to kind of plan their raised beds, Tara?
Definitely. Well, keep in mind that there are things that you can sow right into the ground. So if you don't have a sunny window and can't get things started inside, there are plants like root vegetables and members of the brassica family that don't mind the cooler weather that you can sow sooner than later. And, definitely if you're new to gardening or newer, start small with the food gardening because you don't want to be overwhelmed in your first year. I always say just, plant things that are on your grocery list that, that show up, every week or every other week, like your onions. Onions is a mainstay on my grocery list, as well as garlic or certain herbs like parsley. So I always try to include those in my garden.
Cool. That's a great idea. If you're wondering what to grow, going off of your grocery list, those things that you constantly are looking to buy, right? You're going to use them for sure.
And I don't like having to buy like those little plastic packets of herbs because, they're so expensive for just a small amount and you don't necessarily get through them all the time. So
I'd like to know someone who gets through those. Yeah, we end up buying them to throw them, unfortunately they spoil so quickly.
Yeah. So it's nice to have a living plant that you could just take from when you need.
Exactly. So just as we're kind of getting closer to the end, there are two quick emails who have popped in. Janice has written in, hi, when can we start to prep our raised beds for the growing season? I think we talked a little bit about that before. You want to just quickly go over it again for Janice?
Yeah, as soon as your soil is workable, I've gone out in the past and thought, I can pull some leeks out and broken them off because it's still pretty frozen well down in the soil. So definitely get a trowel in there and just see if your soil is workable. If it's still frozen, give it a few more weeks or a couple of weeks, depending on what the weather's like. And then as soon as the soil is workable, you can amend it and get planting.
Nice. And then lastly, Gail has written in, hello, big fan, all in caps of Tara's. And Gail wonders if she may ask how you broke your leg. Thank you.
Oh. Hello, thank you. One of my other passions is mountain biking. So I slid out on some ice in early February and on my fat bike. So that's how that happened. And, it's definitely, I've already been social distancing for 6 weeks now at least. So I'm very used to working on my couch and, sort of looking ahead to the gardening season. And I've got some seeds ready to go and to plant. So I've got, my husband's going to help me put them under lights because he'll be the one that has to, go down and check on them. But yeah, I'm getting the cast off tomorrow. So hope all goes well.
Excellent.
Thank you for asking.
I'd have to say your timing, if you were going to break your leg at any time of the year, that was probably the best time of year to do it, unfortunately, right, Tara?
Yeah, I didn't mind when it was, those really snowy days and I had to stay inside. It's harder when it's a really nice day out and I want to get out into the garden and just see, I'm one of those people that, goes out almost every day just to see what's new and what's growing and if anything is shooting up from the garden. So I haven't been able to do that yet except for to see the daffodils that are coming up in my front garden right out my living room window here. But, yeah.
So I also want to mention, too, I know we have lots of variety of different gardeners at different stages. And sometimes we talk a little bit about crop rotation, but it seems like it's more for the farmers. But it also is important in raised beds, isn't it, Tara, to not plant the same plant in the same spot?
Absolutely, because, we know that monocultures in a larger sense aren't good. And so on a smaller scale, if you plant your tomatoes in the exact same soil every year, first of all, pests and diseases can overwinter in the soil. So, they might pop back up the following year. I grow a lot of tomatillos because I like to make green salsa in the fall. And I've had problems with the Colorado potato beetle. And so the one year, all my plants were out of the soil, but the pests must have overwintered because I brought a ground cherry home quite early in the season, and I went out a couple of days later, and it had been chewed in its little pot. So, things definitely can overwinter. So what I tried to do is I moved my tomatillos. I mean, you might not have the space to do this, but, I moved them to a different part of my yard and tried to mitigate the damage that way. So it is a good idea to regularly amend the soil because it's depleted of nutrients when the plants are growing in them, and just be mindful of, even if you're moving stuff around in one raised bed, that can work too.
Okay. So even if it's a small bed, you can just kind of like put the peppers in another corner, this year versus...
Absolutely. And keeping in mind that you do want to amend that soil with, add some compost, a really nice top layer of compost to amend that soil. And, hopefully that can add the nutrients back in. You might even want to do a soil test every once in a while if you find that maybe in one particular year your veggies aren't doing that well, just to see what might be missing.
Excellent.
Awesome. So do we have any more questions as we reach the last, 6 minutes of the show? Josh writes in just quickly, great show tonight. Thanks for not talking about the virus tonight. We need more gardeners. So thank you, Josh, for writing it.
Well, I've definitely noticed, even in my Facebook feed, I see a lot of parents starting seeds with their kids. It's a really great activity to do indoors right now. And, I think a lot more people are going to be looking to garden and have food crops that they can pick themselves throughout the spring and summer months.
Yes, I agree. I think it's definitely on people's mind on what we can't. There's so many things we can't do right now, especially leaving our houses. So I think that gardening is something we can do. So whether you've been a lifelong gardener and you've been doing it for a while, or it's something you've always wanted to try. So that's why Matt and I and Tara, you agreed that we felt like despite what was going on, we really wanted to go ahead with the show. And we're all doing it social distancing, so we're all in our own homes, and Gary's been amazing to make that happen. But we really wanted our listeners to just get a little taste of growing in raised beds, and really encourage everybody to start some seeds or to start thinking about gardening.
Well, it's been really fun to chat about it because I'm really anxious to get going. So thank you for having me on.
Oh, you're welcome. Well, thank you. And we do want to give a shout out. So why don't you tell us again the title of your 2 books?
So Raised Bed Revolution and Gardening Your Front Yard.
Excellent. And both are, I see them online, available from Amazon, or if you're in Canada, Chapters Indigo. Or if when we can get to our local bookstores, definitely support your local bookstore. But we realize that is not the time right now. So you can have the book delivered in time for growing.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
That sounds great.
Yeah, it does. So thank you very much, Tara, for taking your time, and good luck tomorrow getting your cast off. Stay safe.
Thank you.
And we really appreciate you coming on, and we're excited about your books. And I know I'm excited to learn more about what you suggest for the front yard because of my garden personally. So I'm looking forward to getting a copy. And again, thank you very much for joining us.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thanks, Tara.
Bye for
Take
now.
care.
Bye. So Matthew, as we mentioned, this is our first show where we're not sitting across from each other.
No, that's right. We're social distancing. We're being apart. We're both at home. And I think it went well. I think we've got a lot of listeners who are still tuning in, and thank you for joining us here on Down the Garden Path at Reality Radio 101. Tara was a great guest, a lot of wonderful information that she had. And I've seen her first book, Raised Bed Revolution, and it's absolutely packed with beautiful, well-illustrated ideas. So if you're thinking about raised beds, definitely take a look at her book. It's filled with inspiration cover to cover. It's fantastic.
And I actually have her new book on gardening your front yard up on my computer screen. That is the one advantage of doing it at home. I can use my second screen. So some of her little, some really creative, some photos of little creative little vignettes in the front yards, and the photos just from the website here on her book are really exciting. So I know she mentioned that lettuce table, so I see a picture of that for the front patio. So some really great ideas. So I think there's something for everyone, and you can definitely check her out online as well, and some ideas. And just your planning and kind of thinking, I think it's always nice to get a fresh perspective and kind of think outside the box, right?
Yeah, for sure. Most certainly. Most certainly.
And I do want to remind our listeners, if you did miss our past few shows, we kind of started you off the beginning of March. Our whole month of March is dedicated to growing, and we did start off, how to start seeds. We had a wonderful show with Megan Kane, the creative vegetable gardener, at creativevegetablegardener.com about growing onions, which so inspired me, the usual anti-starting from seeds girl. I actually have, a grow light, and onions started in my dining room, so I'm so excited. Yeah, and then you and I talked last week about different soils and different composts and the pros and cons to mending our soil when we can start getting outside to get our gardens ready.
That's right. So lots of information to scratch that itch with getting outside. But don't forget not to get outside too early.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
So please, once again, it's another shout out to realize that if you did miss those live shows, they are available as a podcast. So you can, your favorite podcast app, just Google Down the Garden Path, and you can tune in to those shows and have them download. And please, if you've got fellow gardening friends, and this time of year, especially what we're going through with social distancing, now's a great time to just even teach somebody about podcasting, right? And have them have a listen.
That's right. That's right. Well, another hour has flown by.
I know.
Can you believe it?
So we do want to thank everybody for listening and for joining us here on Down the Garden Path. And again, if you've got questions or need to get a hold of either of us, you can reach me at down2earth.ca with the number 2. And all my social media and my contact information is there. And Matthew?
Yeah, you can find me at naturalaffinitydesigns.ca or Matthew at naturalaffinitydesigns.ca with all my social media and links and everything there as well.
Excellent. And we are landscape designers, so I know getting your landscape designed is not on the forefront of everybody's mind, but do know that is something that we can do from a social distance. We can talk, have consultations over the phone. If it's somebody local, I can do, go into measurements without, contacting anybody, or you can, if it's farther away, you can send us your measurements, and that's something we can still help you with. So that's something to keep in mind. Keep your mind off of all the stuff that's going on in the world, and kind of keep your mind on, because I think staycations are going to be the norm for the next little while. So let's turn our yards into where we want to have our outdoor living spaces.
You got it. Very well said. Very well said. Tonight, thank you, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you, Ray, Scott, Tate, Brian, Gail, Janice, and Josh. Thank you for writing in your emails and sharing your questions with Tara. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Gary, for producing the show, as always. And next week, do we have who do we have next week?
Oh, we do. We're hoping to talk about growing flowers, actually having cutting gardens and growing flowers with Janet next week. So we are really looking forward to that. So stay tuned. Country Fresh Gardens. I'm not like her. We both did that. So we will have more information about next week's show, but we're going to switch, and we're still talking about growing, right?
That's right. That's right. I think the last
country cut flowers. There we go.
Country cut flowers. That's right. Excellent. So we hope you all stay tuned for that. And thank you again for tuning in here live on Reality Radio 101. And we will see you all next week.
Excellent. Bye for now.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to Down the Garden Path with your hosts, Joanne Shaw and Matthew Dressing, right here on Reality Radio 101.